they'll be lifted off the street. They'll be taken to a police station where a prosecutor will be waiting for them. A charging decision will be made. They'll be in court within a day or so and commencing their prison sentence not very long after that. And that's essential to bring home to people the consequences of behaving in this kind of thuggish and criminal manner.
At least 779 people have been arrested so far in connection with the riots in towns and cities across the UK, and at least 349 have been charged for a variety of offences. The top prosecutor in England and Wales has warned that hundreds more will be hauled before the courts in the coming days, with longer sentences for the most serious offenders. Stephen Parkinson, the Director of Public Prosecutions, told the Sunday Times that in a new phase of cases, some suspects could be charged with rioting, which carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. It's not about exacting revenge, he said. It's about delivering justice. Well, the Shadow Home Secretary and Conservative Party leadership candidate James Cleverly told Times Radio he backed tough sentences for serious offences.
Well, people need to understand that when they break the rules, there are repercussions. And that's true of the people that have been rioting most recently and previously. When I was Home Secretary, I toughened up the laws around the response to protests and riots and disorder in response to the pro-Gaza, pro-Palestinian public disorder. And so I think it is important we do this. My worry is that this response was too late. It was almost a week after the first of the disorder that we saw Cobra being held, and really important decisions that could and should have been made much earlier in the process weren't made until almost a week after the disorder started. So we got to the right place in the end, but it could and should have been much quicker.
The Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, said rioters would feel the full force of the law.
Well, you've seen an incredibly swift and publicly visible response from the new government to the disorder that we have seen. I think that is important and I think it is necessary. Yes, there is sufficient capacity in the prison system because of decisions that were made in the early days of the new government. We have seen, I think, 780 arrests, 350 people charged already, and there will be more to come, and it will be the case that people will face the full force of the law.
Well, Lord Macdonald, Ken Macdonald, is a former Director of Public Prosecutions and joins us now. Good afternoon, Lord Macdonald.
Hello, Carol.
Do you think that Jonathan Reynolds is right there to talk about swift justice for those responsible for the trouble?
Yeah, I think it has been pretty swift. Well, very swift, actually. I don't really know quite what James Cleverly's saying there. This has been a very swift response. We've had people in court within hours, really, of these events, certainly within a day or so. We've had people already sentenced to 3 years, 2 years, 2.5 years. I think the point that Stephen Parkinson, the Director of Public Prosecutions, is making about riot cases is that, the police have to gather a bit more evidence to support those charges. I think they'll do that over the next day or so, and I think we'll see people in court facing charges of riot for which the maximum sentence is no less than 10 years. So I expect to see more cases with higher sentences over the next few days.
We've been hearing so much about the pressure on the courts and the justice system. How have they coped with so many extra cases? We were hearing that they might be sitting overnight and at weekends. That doesn't seem to have happened. But these cases do seem to have been fast-tracked.
Yes, I mean, the position is that the court system and the justice system, as you've just said, has been under enormous stress since the austerity years, really since about 2012 onwards. I mean, during those years, the CPS lost 30% of its budget and no less than 30% of its prosecutors. Imagine if the NHS had lost 30% of its budget and 30% of its doctors. So there are enormous stresses and strains, and it needs refunding. I think what's been happening is that prosecutors have simply been moved from other duties into these cases, which is what needed to happen because this was a public emergency, really. But it does mean that there'll be further delays in the cases from which they've been moved. So the fact that the justice system has been able to deal with these events shouldn't mislead people into thinking that everything's well with the justice system. It's not. It's under strain, it's underfunded, it's understaffed. It needs serious money to put it right. And I hope these events will have brought home to the government the need for some further investment, considerable further investment in criminal justice, in the police, and indeed in prisons.
Does the sheer scale of the cases that have been fast-tracked through, does that mean that other people who perhaps have already waited months, even years for justice, will face even longer delays?
It probably will mean that, but not to a great extent at the moment. I mean, we've heard that there have been 350 charges. The system is well capable of dealing with a number of that sort. I mean, these charges are spread over many, many areas, so probably not more than 30 or so in each area, which is quite easily manageable. The real strain will come in the future if we see the arrests and the charges move into the thousands. In the rioting in 2011, I think about 2,500 people were charged. Once you get into those sort of numbers, then we would probably have to have courts sitting out of hours and more judges sitting. But at the moment, I think the system is able to cope with these numbers without adding unduly to the stress. But the stress is there already, as I've said. The system is already under stress and needs serious attention from the government.
And of course, we've heard the Prime Minister and other senior ministers repeatedly saying that those responsible for violence will face the full force of the law. And as we've just been discussing, that does mean that cases have been fast-tracked through the system. Are you at all concerned that this is seen in a way of the courts being used to send out this political system? Because, of course, our courts and our justice system, we're very proud of the fact that they're separate from politics.
Yes, I'm sure that the courts and the prosecutors are making independent and fair decisions. They're certainly not influenced by politicians. I mean, when I was director of public prosecutions, no politician ever tried to bring pressure to bear on me. I think it's perfectly appropriate for the government to call on these institutions to deal with these cases swiftly, but they have to be dealt with independently and the judgments have to be fair. Of course, the overwhelming majority of these defendants are pleading guilty, so we can see that their cases are fair. They're admitting what they did and they're being sentenced for what they did. But the key really is speed in crises of this sort. People have to understand that if they commit crimes as part of these sorts of events, they'll be lifted off the street. They'll be taken to a police station where a prosecutor will be waiting for them. A charging decision will be made. They'll be in court within a day or so and commencing their prison sentence not very long after that. And that's essential to bring home to people the consequences of behaving in this kind of thuggish and criminal manner. And it's also important because, you know, one of the things that's been called into question by these events is the capacity of the state to protect the community from thuggishness on the streets. And the state has to respond robustly to that. People have to be confident that they're safe going about the streets and that if men, and it is almost all men, turn up in large numbers to attack other people, to attack buildings, to set fire to buildings, to threaten people, they will be dealt with and they'll be taken off the streets and they'll be sent to prison. So I think that's an entirely appropriate state response, but it has to be done swiftly because that's the nature of the deterrent.
Well, they may be sent to prison swiftly, in particular in those cases that you've outlined where there is strong evidence and where people have pleaded guilty. But Jonathan Reynolds, when he was answering questions about this today, couldn't guarantee that some of them wouldn't actually be let out of prison early because of the overcrowding in our prisons. We had a major discussion about this on the programme yesterday. And the point that was being made was that if you have people who end up being sent to prison, but then the prison is very overcrowded so that there is very little rehabilitation work goes on, and then they're perhaps released even less than halfway through their sentence, it doesn't do anything to address the reasons why they ended up there in the first place.
Well, I believe we have far too many people in prison in this country. We have by far the highest prison population in Western Europe, and I think prisons should be reserved for people who are dangerous, people who are a threat to the community, and perhaps people who persistently offend and simply won't stop. But there are far too many people in prison who are a nuisance. These people don't come into that category. These people at present represented and do represent a threat because they've demonstrated they're prepared to act violently and thuggishly on the streets. Jonathan Reynolds, of course, is not a justice minister. He's the business secretary. I think it's very unlikely that any of these defendants would qualify for early release under half their sentence, because it's been made clear that people who are going to be released early will be people who haven't committed sexual or by and large violent crimes. And most of these people have committed violent crimes, so I don't think they would qualify for early release. But I take your broader point, which is that prisons are far too full. We have far too many people in prison, and most people serving short prison sentences get no interventions, no rehabilitation at all, which is why people released from short sentences reoffend most regularly, something like 50% of them, and they reoffend much more frequently than people who have committed equivalent crimes and are serving community sentences. So I agree with the general point, but I just don't think it applies to these particular individuals who have proved themselves to be violent.
Well, let me just ask you about the other aspect of this. We don't have a lot of time left, but of course, there is a great deal of evidence that some of this was fueled by social media, by various posts on social media, in some cases by far right groups, and in some cases by very high profile individuals, including people like Elon Musk.
Yeah.
It's going to be much harder, isn't it, for the authorities to bring before the courts people who may be responsible for that?
Well, not necessarily. If it's illegal offline, it's illegal online. If the authorities have access to messages, to platforms, to emails, to posts that encourage and incite rioting, that's a criminal offence, and people responsible for those, if they can be identified, can be arrested and prosecuted. And indeed, some people have already been prosecuted and have pleaded guilty on the basis of social media posts. So people need to understand, and the people organising it, if there are people who are actually organising it rather than just sort of shadowy figures encouraging it from behind their keyboards, these people, if they're identified, can certainly be prosecuted for serious offences of conspiracy. I would expect them to be. I think Mr. Musk, frankly, as others have said, should stick to batteries. His understanding of British politics and of the British political situation is woefully short. In fact, he's completely ignorant about our society and about how it works. And I think his interventions have been stupid, ignorant, and unhelpful. And I think he should, frankly, keep his mouth shut, because what he says is not helpful or accurate. But it's certainly the case that people who encourage and incite these sorts of events in posts or by other electronic means are liable to arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment. And I expect to see some of them treated in that way in the coming days and weeks.